Nev had not planned on tackling the Alpha King tonight, but here she was, face down in the frostbitten grass at the edge of the Thornvale, her arms locked around the waist of the most powerful man in the known world, her knees scraped raw through her trousers, her heart slamming so violently against her ribs she was certain something had come loose inside her chest. He was enormous. That was her first coherent thought. She had seen Alpha Soren Ashenmore from a distance dozens of times. Every wolf in the territory had. But distance did something merciful to a man like him. It shrank him down to something almost manageable, made him look like a man and not a force of nature, carved from stone and bad decisions. Up close, with her arms wrapped around him and her face pressed into the small of his back, there was nothing merciful about him at all. He was a wall of muscle and heat, and even through the haze of panic, some traitorous corner of her mind registered that he smelled incredible. Pine and smoke, and something darker underneath, like the earth after a storm. She shoved the thought aside. Now was not the time. 30 seconds ago, she had been finishing her boundary walk along the northern perimeter. The Thornvale forest loomed to her left the way it always did, a black mass of ancient trees that pressed against the ward line like something leaning on a locked door. No one entered the Thornvale. No one had in living memory. The forest was forbidden for reasons older than the pack itself, and Neva had spent the last 3 years walking its edge every night without incident. Then she had seen him. A figure moving through the silver grass toward the tree line, barefoot, unhurried, his arms loose at his sides, his head tilted slightly forward like a man following a sound only he could hear. She had known it was the Alpha before her mind caught up with her eyes. The breadth of his shoulders was unmistakable even in the dark. The way he moved, fluid and predatory even in whatever trance held him, marked him as something more than ordinary. He was walking directly toward the Thornvale, and he was close, closer than anyone should ever be to that tree line. Neve had not thought. Thinking would have stopped her, because thinking would have reminded her that she was a boundary walker, the lowest rung of the pack's hierarchy, and that touching the Alpha King without permission was grounds for punishment she did not want to imagine. She had simply run. Her body had collided with his at full sprint, and the impact had jarred her teeth and rattled every bone in her spine. It was like hitting a wall that happened to be warm and breathing. He had stumbled, 1 step, 2, and she had locked her arms around his waist and pulled backward with everything she had, dragging him away from the ward line by sheer desperate force. His foot had been less than 2 strides from the first tree. Now the world was very still. The grass was cold and damp beneath her. His body was rigid against hers. She could feel the moment awareness returned to him. The sudden tension that rippled through every muscle, the sharp inhale that expanded his ribs against her locked arms. He turned his head. She could not see his face clearly in the dark, but she felt his gaze land on her with a weight that made her stomach drop. "Let go," he said. His voice was low, quiet, completely controlled, and somehow that was worse than if he had shouted. Neve released him so fast she nearly fell backward. She scrambled to her feet, her pulse roaring in her ears, her hands shaking at her sides. "Your Majesty, I am so sorry," she started. "You were walking toward the tree line and I panicked and I should not have touched you, and I know that, I know, but you were so close and I did not think, and please do not have me flogged." She ran out of air. The Alpha stared at her. She could make out the hard angle of his jaw, the sharp line of his cheekbone, the way his dark hair fell across his forehead in a way that should have looked disheveled, but instead looked deliberately sculpted by someone with an unfair understanding of aesthetics. He said nothing. The silence was so loud it had a texture. Neve's mouth opened again, ready to fill it with more frantic apology. But before she could speak, movement erupted from the tree line to their right. 3 guards burst from the patrol path, weapons drawn, their faces tight with alarm. Behind them came a 4th figure. Tall and lean with close-cropped silver hair and the calm, assessing gaze of a man who had spent decades managing catastrophe. Haddon, the Alpha's beta. The guards froze when they saw the scene. Their Alpha standing in the grass near the ward line. A boundary walker trembling beside him. the Thornveil looming at their backs like a held breath. Haddon took in the situation in a single glance. His expression did not change, but something shifted behind his eyes. "Stand down," he said to the guards. "Return to patrol. Speak of this to no one." The guards hesitated, glanced at one another, and then retreated without a word. Haddon turned to Neve. "Your name?" "Neve," she managed. "Boundary walker, northern perimeter, third rotation." Haddon looked at the Alpha. Something passed between them, silent and heavy and completely incomprehensible to Neve. Then Haddon turned back to her. "Go home," he said. "Do not speak of what you saw tonight. Do you understand?" Neve nodded. Her legs felt like they belonged to someone else, as she backed away, turned, and walked as fast as dignity would allow toward the boundary outpost. She made it around the first hill before she started running. Behind her, the Thornveil stood silent, its canopy swaying gently in a wind that touched nothing else. She did not sleep that night. She lay in her narrow cot at the outpost and stared at the ceiling and replayed every second, the way he had walked toward those trees, the emptiness in his stride, the terrifying blankness that had preceded the moment he came back to himself, and the way he had looked at her when he did. Not with anger, not with gratitude, with something she could not name, something that looked almost like fear. Dawn arrived thin and gray. Neve dressed with hands that still trembled and opened the door to find a palace guard standing in the corridor, his face carefully blank. "Boundary Walker Neve," he said. "You have been summoned to the keep. The Alpha requires your presence immediately." The room they put her in was small, windowless, and smelled like it had not been opened in years. Dust floated in the light from a single candle. The chair was hard. The walls were bare stone. Every surface seemed designed to make the person sitting in it feel as insignificant as possible. It was working. Neve sat with her hands pressed flat against her thighs and tried to calculate how many different ways this could end badly. The number was high. She was still calculating when the door opened and Haddon stepped inside. "Miss Neve," he said, his tone maddeningly neutral. "Thank you for coming." "I was not aware I had a choice," Neve replied. The corner of his mouth twitched, just barely. "Tell me exactly what happened last night, from the beginning." Neve told him. The boundary walk, the figure in the grass, the sprint, the collision, the way the Alpha had been moving toward the Thornveil with the steady, unhurried pace of a man walking home. "And when you touched him?" Haddon said. "What happened?" He stopped. Neve frowned, remembering. Not immediately. It took a moment, like something was holding him, and then let go. Haddon was quiet for several beats. His fingers tapped once against his folded arms. "You pulled him away from the ward line, physically." "Yes. And he didn't throw you." Neve blinked. "Throw me?" Haddon leaned back slightly. 3 times in the last 4 months, guards have attempted to intercept the Alpha during these episodes. Each time, he threw them. Unconsciously, reflexively. One man broke his collarbone. Another dislocated a shoulder. The Alpha's wolf lashes out at anyone who interferes. Neva went pale, but he did not react to me at all. "No," Haddon said. He did not. The silence that followed sat between them like a living thing. "How long has this been happening?" Neve asked, her voice smaller than she intended. Haddon studied her for a long moment, as if weighing whether she had earned the truth. 9 months, he said, since the end of the Grimholt siege. 9 months. Neve's mind reeled. The Alpha King had been sleepwalking toward a cursed forest for 9 months, and no one outside his inner circle knew. "The episodes are increasing in frequency," Haddon continued, his voice dropping, "and he is getting closer to the tree line each time. Last night was the closest he has ever been." He paused. "If you had not been there, he would have crossed." The weight of those words pressed down on her like a physical force. She could feel the blood draining from her face. "What happens if he crosses?" she whispered. Haddon did not answer. He did not need to. The look on his face said everything. "I need you to do something," he said instead. "And I need you to understand that this stays between us and the Alpha. No one else." Neve nodded, unable to find words. "Tonight, The Alpha will hold his evening council in the war room. I want you present, nearby, not involved in the proceedings, just in the room. Why? Neve asked. I want to see if your proximity has any measurable effect on his condition during waking hours. Neve stared at him. You want to use me as a test. I want to understand why you could touch him when no one else can. Haddon's gaze was steady. And I suspect you want to understand that too. He was right, and she hated that he was right. That evening, a guard led her through corridors she had never walked before. The keep was a different world from the boundary outposts and patrol shacks she knew. Polished stone floors, tapestries older than her grandmother, the smell of beeswax and old wood, and the faint, lingering traces of power that seemed to seep from the walls themselves. The war room was long and lined with maps. Campaigns from a century of border disputes covered every wall, their edges curling and yellowed with age. A fire burned in the hearth at the far end, throwing shifting light across the faces of the 7 council members seated around the oak table. The air smelled of pipe smoke and old leather, and the particular tension that clings to rooms where powerful men argue about things that affect people they will never meet. Neve was acutely aware of how out of place she was. Her boots still carried mud from the boundary trail. Her jacket was patched at both elbows. Every person in this room wore fine wool and polished silver, and she felt their awareness of her like a cold draft. And at the head of that table sat Alpha Soren Ashenmore. Neve had to stop herself from stumbling. Distance really had been doing her favors, because up close and in proper light, the Alpha was devastating. Sharp jaw, high cheekbones, dark hair swept back from a face that looked like it had been carved by someone trying to capture the exact midpoint between beautiful and dangerous. His eyes were the deep gray of riverstone, and when they swept the room, everything they touched seemed to hold its breath. But she saw what she had seen last night, too. The shadows beneath those eyes, the hollows in his cheeks, the slight tremor in his left hand that he hid by resting it flat on the table. He was deteriorating. Slowly, carefully, so that no one who was not looking for it would notice. But Neve was looking, and she could see it plainly. He looked like a man being consumed from the inside. Haddon guided her to a chair along the wall, well behind the council members. Sit here, he murmured. Do nothing. Say nothing. She sat. The meeting proceeded. Trade disputes, border patrols, harvest projections. Neve understood almost none of it and cared about even less, because every scrap of her attention was fixed on the Alpha. 20 minutes passed. She watched his hand. The tremor slowed, then stopped. 30 minutes. The tension in his shoulders, a rigid set that looked permanent, began to ease. His breathing changed, deepened, steadied. He leaned back in his chair, and for the first time, his posture looked like something other than a man bracing against pain. 40 minutes. He turned a page in the report before him, and his hand was perfectly steady. Neve looked at Haddon. The beta was already looking at her, his expression carefully blank but his eyes bright with something she could not quite read. The meeting ended. The council members filed out. Neve rose to follow, but a voice stopped her. Wait. She turned. The Alpha was still seated. He was looking at her, and the directness of his gaze hit her like a gust of wind. You were here last night, he said. It was not a question. Yes, Your Majesty. He studied her face for a long moment. Up close, his eyes were not just gray. They had flecks of silver near the center, and looking into them felt like falling. Thank you, he said quietly. The words were rough, like they had to travel through something jagged to reach the surface. But they were real, and the rawness of them made her chest ache. You are welcome, Your Majesty, Neve replied. She wanted to say more. She wanted to ask him 100 questions, but his expression had already shifted, closing like a door, and she recognized the dismissal for what it was. She turned and walked toward the corridor. Haddon fell into step beside her before she had gone 10 paces. He is requiring your presence tonight, the beta said, at his private chambers, after sundown. Neve stopped walking. Her heart lurched so hard she thought she might be sick. His private chambers, she repeated flatly. Yes, Why? Haddon looked at her with an expression that bordered on sympathy. Because tonight, for the first time in 9 months, the tremor in his hand stopped. The walk to the Alpha's chambers felt like the longest walk of Neve's life, which was saying something for a woman who spent every night patrolling a cursed tree line. 2 guards stood outside the heavy wooden doors. They did not look at her. They did not acknowledge her existence. They simply opened the doors and stepped aside. Neve walked in and immediately forgot how her lungs worked. The room was enormous. A fire crackled in a stone hearth wide enough to stand in. Furs and woven tapestries covered the walls. Tall windows overlooked the northern ridge, and beyond the ridge, visible even in the fading light, the black mass of the Thornvale stretched to the horizon. And the bed. It dominated the center of the far wall like a throne lying on its side, massive, dark-framed, piled with furs and heavy blankets. She was staring at the bed when Soren stepped through a side door. He had removed his council jacket. His shirt was unlaced at the collar, and the firelight caught the strong lines of his throat and the sharp cut of his collarbones. He looked less guarded here, less armored, and somehow that made him more intimidating rather than less. "Boundary walker," he said. "Neve," she corrected before she could stop herself. Then she flinched. "Sorry. You can call me whatever you prefer, Your Majesty." He studied her with that unsettling directness. "Neve," he repeated, and the way her name sounded in his voice made her pulse jump. "Haddon has explained the arrangement." "He has not, actually." Neve clasped her hands together in front of her to stop them from fidgeting. "He told me to come here. That is the extent of what I know." Something shifted in Soren's expression. Annoyance, maybe, though whether it was directed at her or at Haddon she could not tell. "The sleepwalking has been worsening," he said, his tone clipped. "My wolf tries to reach the Thornvale every night. The episodes cannot be controlled, and until now, they could not be interrupted." He paused. "Until you." Neve waited. Her stomach was doing something acrobatic and deeply unhelpful. "I need you here, in these chambers. At night, your presence appears to suppress the episodes, or at least delay them long enough for my body to rest." "So you want me to sleep here," Neve said slowly. "I want you nearby while I sleep," Soren corrected. "There is a difference, not a very large one," Neve muttered under her breath. His eyes narrowed slightly, and she pressed her lips together. "This is a security matter," he continued. "No one outside my inner circle knows about the episodes. If the court discovered that the Alpha was walking toward the Thornvale in his sleep every night, the political consequences would be severe." "Meaning everyone would panic," Neve offered. "Meaning rival packs would see an opportunity," Soren corrected, his voice carrying a warning edge. "And my people would lose faith in the one person standing between them and the next war." That sobered her fast. She looked at the bed, then at him, then back at the bed. "Just to be perfectly clear," Neve said, her voice slightly higher than normal, "I will be sleeping in that bed." "No." Soren gestured toward the far wall. A narrow cot had been set up beside the window, fitted with a single blanket and a pillow so thin it looked apologetic. "You will be sleeping there," he said. "Oh," Neve said, and she hated the tiny flicker of something that might have been disappointment. "Of course. That makes much more sense. Obviously." She was talking too much. She always talked too much when she was nervous, and right now she was so nervous her teeth were practically vibrating. Soren crossed to the far side of the room and sat on the edge of the bed. The mattress barely dipped under his weight, which seemed unfair given how large he was. He pulled off his boots and set them aside with the precise, deliberate movements of a man who did everything with control. "The fire stays lit throughout the night," he said without looking at her. "The door remains locked from the inside. If an episode occurs and I begin to move, do not attempt to restrain me. Speak to me. Use my name." "Your name," Neve repeated, "not your title. Titles do not reach me when I am in that state. Names do." He paused. "Or yours did." That admission seemed to cost him something. She watched the muscles in his jaw tighten, watched him look away toward the window where the Thornvale was just barely visible against the night sky. Neve moved to the cot and sat down. The thin mattress crunched under her, and the pillow was exactly as pathetic as it looked. She unlaced her boots and set them beside the cot, then pulled the blanket over her legs. The fire cracked. Shadows moved across the ceiling. She could hear him breathing, slow and controlled, the kind of breathing that belonged to a man who had taught himself to manage pain through sheer force of will. She stared at the ceiling. Minutes passed. 10, 20, 30. Sleep was not even a distant possibility. Every nerve in her body was aware of him. She could feel his presence across the room the way you could feel a bonfire even with your eyes closed. Constant, radiating, impossible to ignore. More minutes crawled by. She counted the stones in the ceiling. She listened to the fire. She tried not to think about the fact that the most powerful wolf in the territory was lying 15 feet away from her in the dark. Then his breathing changed. It deepened, loosened, lost the rigid control that held it in place during waking hours. The subtle tension that hummed through the room like a plucked string went slack. Neve turned her head carefully and looked toward the bed. The firelight was low, but she could make out his shape beneath the furs. His chest rose and fell in a rhythm that was unmistakably, deeply, genuinely asleep. He did not stir, he did not rise, he did not walk. Neve watched him for a long time, something tight and unnamed loosening in her own chest. He looked younger in sleep. The hard lines of command softened. The weight he carried seemed to lift, just slightly, just enough for her to glimpse the man beneath the alpha. She pressed her face into the thin pillow and felt her own body finally begin to relax. When she woke, pale gray light was filtering through the windows. She had slept deeply, dreamlessly. The fire had burned down to embers, and the Alpha King was standing at the window with his back to her, dressed and composed, as if he had been awake for hours. She sat up quickly, pushing hair from her face. "Your Majesty, did you? Was there an episode?" "No," he said without turning. His voice was quieter than usual, almost careful. "No episode." A beat of silence. "Then it worked," Neve said softly. He turned. The morning light caught the sharp planes of his face, and she saw something there she had not expected. Not relief, not gratitude. Something raw, something that looked almost like grief. "It would appear so," he said. Then, after a pause that felt heavy enough to bruise, "This arrangement continues. Every night, until further notice. You will report to these chambers after sundown and leave before the household wakes." Nev nodded slowly. "And the boundary walks? Haddon will reassign your rotation. And if someone asks where I go every night?" "No one will ask," Soren said, and the certainty in his voice carried the weight of command. "And if they do, you say nothing." He moved toward the door, then stopped. Without turning, without looking at her, he said, "The pillow will be replaced." Then he was gone. Neve sat on the edge of the cot in the empty room, her heart beating unevenly, and tried to process the fact that the Alpha King of Ashenmore had just noticed her pillow was inadequate. That evening, when she returned to his chambers, a new pillow sat on the cot. It was thick, stuffed with down, and wrapped in a case that was softer than anything she had ever owned. She pressed her face into it and breathed, and tried very hard not to smile. 3 nights passed without incident. Soren slept. Neve slept. No sleepwalking. No episodes. The arrangement was working, and it terrified her in ways she could not articulate, because arrangements ended. On the 4th night, she woke to a sound she could not immediately identify. A low, guttural vibration that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. She sat up. The fire had burned to almost nothing. The room was dark, lit only by the faint, silver glow of moonlight through the windows. Soren was standing at the window. His eyes were open but empty. That same terrible blankness she had seen the first night. His hands were pressed flat against the glass, and the glass was vibrating under his palms. Beyond the window, visible in the moonlight, the Thornvale was moving, not swaying, moving. The trees at the forest edge were leaning toward the keep, their branches reaching, stretching, like fingers straining toward something just out of grasp. The low vibration was coming from his chest. Not a growl, not a whimper. Something deeper, something that sounded like a response, like an answer to a call. Neve's blood went cold. She threw the blanket aside and crossed the room on bare feet. Soren, she said. Her voice came out as a whisper. He did not react. Soren. Louder now. Nothing. She reached for his arm. The moment her fingers touched his skin, two things happened at once. The vibration stopped, and an image flashed through her mind, so vivid and violent it nearly drove her to her knees. Trees, darkness, a path of black earth winding between trunks that twisted like broken bones. And at the end of the path, deep in the heart of the Thornvale, something was waiting, something that knew his name. Neve gasped and pulled her hand back. The image vanished. Soren blinked, his eyes clearing, his body going rigid with sudden awareness. He looked at her, then at his hands pressed against the glass, then at the forest beyond. The Thornvale had gone still. It reached you here, Neve breathed, her voice shaking. Even with me in the room. The forest reached you here. Soren said nothing. His jaw was clenched so tightly she could see the muscles jumping beneath his skin. His hands dropped from the glass, and she watched them curl into fists at his sides. He turned away from the window without a word and walked back toward the bed. He sat on the edge of it, his elbows on his knees, his head bowed. He looked like a man running out of time. Neve stood in the dark, trembling. The afterimage of that black path still burned behind her eyes, and understood for the first time that whatever was happening here was far worse than sleepwalking. The forest was not just calling him, it was coming for him. A rhythm formed between them, quiet and careful, the way a path forms through a meadow when the same feet walk it enough times. Every evening after sundown, Neve arrived at the Alpha's chambers. Every morning before the household stirred, she slipped out. The hours between belonged to the strange, suspended world they had built without ever agreeing to build it. In the beginning, neither of them spoke. She lay on her cot, he lay on his bed. The fire burned between them like a boundary marker, and the silence was thick enough to lean against. But silence, Neve discovered, had a limited shelf life when she was anxious. And she was always anxious. So she started talking. Not about anything important. She told him about the Fox family that had dug a den near the eastern boundary marker, and the way the kits tumbled over each other at dusk like furry, incompetent acrobats. She told him about the time she had stepped into a hidden stream during a winter patrol and spent 2 hours walking her route with one boot frozen solid and the other squelching with every step. She told him about the constellation she had named herself when she was 12, because the official name was unpronounceable and, in her opinion, did not suit the shape at all. He did not respond, not once. Not a grunt, not a breath, not a single indication he was listening. She assumed she was talking to the ceiling and made her peace with it. Then, 4 mornings later, as she laced her boots to leave, he spoke without looking up from the report he was already reading. The constellation, the one you renamed, what did you call it? Nev froze with one boot half-laced. He had been listening. He had remembered. The drunk heron, she said after a beat. He looked at her. A pause stretched between them, strange and charged. Then the corner of his mouth twitched. Not quite a smile, but close enough that it made her heart do something it absolutely should not have been doing. It does look like a heron, he said. A drunk one, Neve clarified. I will take your word for it. She left the room smiling and did not stop smiling until she reached the boundary outpost, where the on-duty patrol guard gave her a suspicious look that she completely ignored. The small things accumulated after that, arriving so quietly she almost did not notice them. The thin blanket on her cot was replaced by a heavier one, lined with wool. She said nothing. He said nothing. It simply appeared. The fire, which had always burned low by the time she arrived, began arriving already stoked and blazing. She never saw him do it. She suspected he would deny it if asked. A cup of tea appeared on the table beside her cot one evening, still steaming. She stared at it for a full minute before picking it up. It was chamomile, her favorite, though she had never told him that. Thank you for the tea, she said into the dark. I do not know what you are referring to, Soren replied from the bed, his voice perfectly flat. Neve bit her lip and drank the tea and felt something warm settle in her chest that had nothing to do with chamomile. She brought him food one night. She had noticed he ate poorly, picking at meals the way a man does when his body needs fuel but his mind has forgotten how to want it. She carried a plate of bread, cheese, and dried venison wrapped in cloth and set it on the table beside his stack of correspondence without comment. He looked at the food, then at her, then back at the food. "You brought me dinner," he said. "You forgot to eat yours," she replied. Again, I checked. His expression shifted into something she could not read. "You checked." "The kitchen staff talk," Neve said, settling onto her cot. "Apparently the Alpha's dinner tray has been coming back full for months. It has become something of a concern." He said nothing for a long moment. Then he picked up the bread and ate it. All of it. And the cheese. And the venison. Neve watched from the corner of her eye and pretended she was not keeping track. During the days she visited Vedra, the pack's senior healer, a sharp-eyed woman with iron-gray hair and a voice that could curdle milk or comfort a dying man with equal ease. "I need to understand why this works," Neve said, sitting on the edge of Vedra's examination table while the healer studied her with an intensity that made her feel like a specimen. "Why me?" Vedra pressed cool fingers to Neve's wrist, counted her pulse, frowned. She checked her eyes, her throat, her temperature. She held dried lavender under her nose and watched her reaction. She pricked her finger and tested her blood against 3 different tinctures. She made Neve sit in increasingly ridiculous positions while she waved smoking bundles of dried herbs around her head and muttered things that sounded half like prayers and half like complaints about the inadequacy of modern medicine. "Am I dying?" Neve asked after the 7th test. "Not presently," Vedra replied without looking up, "though I reserve the right to revisit that assessment." After nearly an hour of poking, prodding, and one deeply uncomfortable sniff test, the healer straightened and crossed her arms. "There is nothing remarkable about your biology," Vedra announced finally. "Thank you," Neve said dryly. "That is exactly what every woman wants to hear." Vedra ignored her. "Your scent carries traces of the boundary herbs you work with: thorn mint, night sage, silverleaf, all plants that grow along the Thornvale's edge. Years of handling them have embedded the compounds into your skin. And you think those herbs suppress his episodes? I think it is possible." Vedra paused, wiping her hands on her apron. "But herbs alone do not explain why his wolf accepts your touch when it rejects everyone else." That sat between them, unanswered and heavy. "There is something else," Vedra said carefully. "Something I cannot measure with tinctures." She studied Neve with a gaze that seemed to peel back layers. "Have you felt anything unusual?" "A pull. A draw toward him that feels disproportionate to your actual relationship." Neve's face burned. "He is the alpha. Everyone feels drawn to him." "That is not what I asked." Neve looked at her hands. The truth was she had felt it. A pull that went beyond deference, beyond respect, beyond the natural gravity of an alpha's presence. Something deeper. Something that tugged at the base of her ribs whenever she was near him and ached when she was not. "I do not know what I feel," she lied. Vedra watched her for a long moment, then nodded slowly. "Keep me informed," she said. "Any changes, anything at all." That night, the routine shifted. Neve woke to the sound of movement. Not the sharp, purposeful stride of a sleepwalking episode. Something smaller, more restless. Soren was turning in the bed, his body twisting beneath the furs, his breathing ragged and uneven. Not awake, not walking, but fighting something in his sleep. "Soren," she said softly. The restlessness eased slightly but did not stop. His jaw clenched. A low sound escaped his throat, something between a growl and a groan, and his fists tightened in the sheets. Neve rose from the cot and crossed the room. She knelt beside the bed. "Soren," she said again, closer now. His face was tight with pain, the muscles in his neck corded, his breathing coming in short, sharp bursts. Whatever he was seeing behind his eyes, it was hurting him. She reached out and took his hand. The contact was electric, a shock that ran up her arm and burst through her chest like light through a cracked door. She gasped. His fingers clamped around hers, hard enough to hurt, and his entire body went rigid for one suspended heartbeat. Then he exhaled, long, slow, shuddering. His grip loosened but did not release. His face smoothed, his breathing deepened, and within 30 seconds, he was sleeping peacefully again, his fingers still wrapped around hers. Neve knelt there in the dark for a long time, her pulse hammering, her skin tingling where their hands touched, and felt something shift between them that could never be shifted back. In the morning, she moved her cot closer to the bed. She did not ask. He did not comment. But when she arrived that evening, the cot had been moved closer still, and on the table beside it, another cup of tea sat steaming. The first time she entered the Thornvale, she was not asleep and she was not dreaming. It had been 3 weeks since she first took his hand in the dark. 3 weeks of nightly routine, of quiet conversation, of the slow erosion of distance between her cot and his bed until barely 4 feet separated them. 3 weeks of his hand finding hers in the dark whenever the restlessness crept in, his fingers closing around hers with a desperate certainty that made her chest tight. Vedra's theory about the boundary herbs had proven partially correct. The healer had created a concentrated salve from the same compounds found in Neve's skin and applied it to the alpha's wrists and temples before sleep. It helped. A little, but only a little. The herbs are a component, Vedra admitted, frowning over her notes. But not the whole answer. Whatever you are doing for him, it cannot be bottled. What Neve was doing, as far as she could tell, was simply being there. It did not feel like enough. It did not feel like it should work. But every night, the Alpha King of Ashenmoor fell asleep holding her hand like it was the only solid thing in a world that kept trying to drag him under, and every morning, he woke having slept through the night, until the night the forest pushed harder than it ever had before. She felt it before she heard it, a pressure in the air, a thickening, like the room itself was being squeezed. The fire, blazing minutes ago, guttered and shrank. The shadows deepened in the corners, pooling like dark water. Soren's breathing changed, not the gentle restlessness she had grown used to managing with a touch and a murmured word. This was something violent. His back arched off the mattress. His hands clawed at the sheets. A sound tore from his chest that was not human, not wolf, but something between the two that made every hair on Neva's body stand on end. She lunged for him. Soren. Her hands found his arm, his shoulder, his face. She cupped his jaw and turned his head toward her. Soren, come back. I am right here. His eyes opened, but they were not his eyes. They were black, not dark gray, not shadowed, black from edge to edge, like the pupil had swallowed everything. And then the room disappeared. Neve was standing in the Thornvale. She knew it instantly, not because she recognized the trees, though she did, the same twisted, skeletal shapes she had seen in that flash of vision weeks ago. She knew it because the air tasted wrong, cold and damp and heavy with ash, like breathing through a funeral shroud. The forest was darker than any natural night. The trees pressed close, their bark slick and black, their branches tangling overhead in a canopy that blocked every trace of sky. The ground beneath her bare feet was soft in a way that felt organic and unsettling, like standing on something alive. And the silence was the worst part. It was not the absence of sound, it was the presence of listening. Something vast and patient was aware of her, and it was paying attention. Soren? Her voice came out small, swallowed almost immediately by the dark. She moved forward. The path was narrow and winding, and the trees seemed to shift at the edges of her vision, rearranging themselves when she was not looking directly at them. Her heart hammered. Her hands shook. She found him in a clearing. He was standing, not kneeling, not collapsed, but standing with his back straight and his head raised, looking at something she could not yet see. Soren, she called, moving toward him. He did not respond. She reached his side and looked at his face. The expression she found there stopped her cold. It was not fear. It was not pain. It was resignation. The quiet, terrible acceptance of someone who had stopped fighting. She followed his gaze and her breath died in her throat. The clearing was full of the dead. They stood in ragged rows between the trees. Dozens of them. their forms flickering like candle flames in a draught. Soldiers in torn ashen-moor colors, their wounds raw and permanent. Wolves in human form, their faces slack, their eyes reflecting nothing. Civilians with ash in their hair and blood on their hands. And in front of them all, closer than the rest, a young man. He was barely more than a boy. 17, maybe 18. He had Soren's jaw, Soren's cheekbones, a softer version of the same face with eyes that should have been bright but were flat and empty now. He wore ashen-moor battle leathers, and the wound in his side was deep and dark and final. Ansel, Soren said. The name cracked in his mouth like something broken. Nev felt the bond pulse between them, and with it came a flood of memory that was not hers. A battlefield. Smoke and screaming and the clash of steel on steel, the Grimholt siege at its worst, the final push, the desperate gamble that would end the war or lose it. And in the chaos, a face that should not have been there. A boy in borrowed armor, too young, too eager, following his older brother into the line because he wanted to prove he was ready. Soren screaming at him to fall back. The boy grinning, fearless, stupid with youth and worship, and the unshakable belief that his brother would keep him safe. The arrow that came from nowhere. The way the grin froze. The way he fell. The way Soren caught him and held him and watched the light leave his eyes in a muddy field 300 miles from home. Neve was weeping. She could feel the tears on her face, hot and uncontrollable, and she could feel Soren's grief through the bond, like a blade buried in her own chest. The ghost of Ansel stepped forward. You told me to stay behind. His voice was gentle, almost kind, and that made it monstrous. But you knew I would follow. You always knew. And you let me come anyway. No, Neve whispered, gripping Soren's arm. That is not true. Soren, that is not him. The forest is using his face. But Soren was not listening. His eyes were fixed on his brother's ghost, and the agreement in his expression was the most terrifying thing Neve had ever seen. She pulled, with her hands, with her will, with whatever force connected them. She grabbed his arm with both hands and hauled him backward, away from the clearing, away from the dead, away from the boy with the wound that would not close. The forest screamed. There was no other word for it. The trees shook, the ground buckled. The air split with a sound like tearing metal, and then they were back. The bedchamber, the dying fire, the firs in the stone walls and the cold night air pouring through the window. Neve was on the floor beside the bed, her hands still locked around Soren's arm, her body trembling violently. Her face was wet with tears. Her chest heaved. Soren was sitting up in the bed, his eyes clear, his face bone white, his breathing ragged and raw. He looked at her, and she watched the realization settle over him like a killing frost. You were there, he said. His voice was barely a sound. You saw him. Neve could not speak. She nodded. Soren closed his eyes. Something shattered behind his expression, something he had been holding together through sheer force for a very long time. His name was Ansel, he said. He was my brother, and I let him die. 3 days of silence followed. Soren did not send her away. Not immediately, but he stopped speaking. He stopped looking at her. The tea no longer appeared on her table. The fire was no longer stoked before she arrived. Every small, quiet gesture that had been building between them was withdrawn, brick by brick, as if he were dismantling something he had never meant to build. Nev felt each withdrawal like a wound. She still came every night. She still lay on her cot, with her hand extended across the gap between them, waiting. He still took it, because without the contact, the episodes returned within minutes, dragging him toward the window, toward the forest, toward the dark. But his grip was different now, mechanical, obligatory. The warmth was gone. On the third night, she broke. You cannot shut me out because I saw what I saw, she said into the dark. Her voice came out steadier than she felt. I was there. I saw the thorn veil. I saw what it does to you. Pretending it did not happen does not undo it. His hand tightened around hers. Not with affection, with warning. What happened in the thorn veil was a mistake, he said. My mistake. You should never have been pulled in. But I was, and it will not happen again. His voice carried the hard, flat edge of command. Because this arrangement is ending. The words hit her like a physical blow. She sat up, staring through the dark toward his shape on the bed. What? Tomorrow night, you return to the boundary outpost. Haddon will reassign your rotation. Vedra will continue working on a herbal solution. He paused. This was always meant to be temporary. Temporary, Neve repeated, and she could hear the crack in her own voice. Soren, without me here, you will walk into that forest. That is my concern, not yours. It became my concern the moment I tackled you in the grass. She threw the blanket aside and stood. You are asking me to walk away knowing that the thorn veil is getting stronger, knowing that every night it comes closer to taking you, knowing what I know about what it does to you in there. Yes, he said. That is exactly what I am asking. Why? The silence that followed was so long she thought he might not answer at all. When he did, his voice had lost its edge. What remained was raw and tired and honest in a way she had never heard from him before. Because the forest recognized you. The words fell like stones into still water. When you entered the thorn veil, it saw you. It learned your scent, your presence, the shape of whatever connects us. And now it will use you to reach me. Nev's blood chilled. Every night since, I have felt it searching for you, Soren continued, reaching through the bond, trying to find the thread that leads to you. If you stay near me, it will pull you in again, and next time, you may not be able to pull yourself out. You do not know that. I will not risk it. His voice hardened again, and she heard the alpha beneath the man, the wolf that commanded thousands, the king whose word was law. This is not a discussion, it is a decision, and I have made it. Soren, go. The word was quiet, but it filled the room. Please, please. He had never said please to her before. And somehow that single word, that tiny fracture in his armor, hurt worse than the dismissal itself. Neve stood in the dark for 3 long heartbeats. Then she picked up her boots and left. The door closed behind her with a sound like something ending. She made it to the end of the corridor before the shaking started. She pressed her back against the cold stone wall and slid down until she was sitting on the floor, her boots clutched to her chest, her body trembling with something that went deeper than cold. The ache settled into her bones that night and did not leave. 4 days passed, then 5, then 6. Neve returned to her boundary walks. She patrolled the northern perimeter the way she always had, following the ward line, marking her checkpoints, cataloging the growth patterns of the Thornvale's edge. Everything was the same. Everything was completely different. The headache started on the 2nd day. Dull at first, a pressure behind her eyes that she attributed to poor sleep. By the 4th day, they were blinding. Light became an enemy. Sound became a weapon. She walked her patrols with her jaw clenched and her eyes half shut, counting steps to distract herself from the pain. Her wolf, quiet and obedient her entire life, began to pace. She could feel it beneath her skin, restless, agitated, circling like something caged. It wanted to run. It wanted to run toward the keep, toward him, with a desperation that frightened her. She stopped eating. Not deliberately. Her stomach simply rejected food. Everything tasted like ash. The hollowness spread from her chest outward, emptying her in stages, and by the 6th day, she was running on water and stubbornness and very little else. She heard things through the boundary outpost guards, whispered fragments about the Alpha's declining condition, that he had missed 2 council meetings, that Haddon had been seen pacing the corridors at night, that the healer Vedra had been summoned to the Alpha's chambers 3 times in 1 week. On the 7th day, she heard that 2 guards had been injured attempting to stop a sleepwalking episode. One had a broken arm, the other had been thrown into a wall hard enough to crack the stone. He was getting worse. Without her, he was getting worse, and she was forbidden from helping. The collapse happened on the 8th morning. She was delivering a boundary report to the keep, a routine task that required climbing 3 flights of stairs and crossing the main hall. Simple. She had done it 100 times. She made it to the 2nd landing before the gray crept in at the edges of her vision. Her legs, which had been trembling all morning, simply stopped working. The report slipped from her fingers. The stone floor rushed up to meet her. She heard a voice, far away and very close at the same time. Her name, sharp and raw and broken in a way that stripped it down to something primal. Neve. Arms caught her before she hit the ground. Huge, impossibly strong, shaking with a fine tremor that she could feel even through the fog swallowing her consciousness. She was lifted, pulled against a chest that radiated heat, and she could hear a heartbeat beneath her ear, fast and frantic and thundering. A growl vibrated through the body holding hers, low and dangerous and directed at every living thing in the vicinity. She heard footsteps retreating, heard voices cut short mid-sentence, heard Haddon's calm murmur somewhere nearby and Soren's snarled response, two words that she could not quite make out but that carried the unmistakable weight of a threat. Then she was moving, being carried. The rhythm of his stride was urgent, almost running, and his arms tightened around her with every step as if he were afraid she might dissolve. She wanted to tell him she was fine. She wanted to open her eyes and say something clever, something to break the terrible tension she could feel radiating from him like heat from a forge. But her body had stopped cooperating entirely, and the darkness pulled her under before she could form a single word. She woke in the healer's wing. The light was low, the air smelled of dried herbs and clean linen, and, beneath it all, him, pine and smoke and storm. Soren sat beside her bed. His elbows rested on his knees. His head was bowed. His hands were clasped together so tightly the knuckles had gone white, and the posture spoke of someone who had been sitting exactly like that for a very long time. When she stirred, his head snapped up. The relief that flooded his face was so naked, so unguarded, it stole whatever breath she had managed to gather. "You are awake," the words cracked on their way out of him. Apparently, Neve managed. Her throat felt like sand. He reached for her, stopped himself, pulled his hand back. The conflict in his expression was agonizing to watch. He wanted to touch her. He was terrified of touching her. "How long?" she asked. 6 hours. Vedra says you collapsed from exhaustion and, he paused, from bond deprivation. The words hung in the air between them. Bond deprivation, Neve repeated quietly. Soren looked away. His jaw was tight. A muscle jumped beneath the skin. She had quite a lot to say on the subject, he said. His tone carried the particular strain of a man who had recently been lectured by a healer who did not care that he was king. As if summoned, Vedra appeared in the doorway. Her expression was the carefully composed mask of a woman holding back a significant amount of professional opinion. "If you are done hovering, Your Majesty," Vedra said, "I need a moment with my patient." Soren looked at Neve. She saw the war in his eyes, the desperate pull toward her and the equally desperate fear of what that pull meant. Then he stood, inclined his head to Vedra, and walked out without another word. His footsteps had barely faded before Vedra turned to Neve with both eyebrows raised. "You share a mate bond," Vedra said. "No preamble, no softening. You and the Alpha, incomplete, unacknowledged, but forming whether either of you cooperates or not." Neve opened her mouth. "Do not insult my intelligence by denying it," Vedra continued. "The symptoms are textbook: headaches, loss of appetite, physical deterioration in the absence of your bonded partner. Your wolf is trying to reach him. His wolf is trying to reach you. And the longer you stay apart, the worse it will get." Neve stared at the ceiling. Her eyes burned. "There is more," Vedra said, and her voice softened for the first time. "The thorn veil is connected to him through the curse, and now, through the bond, it is connected to you. If the forest takes him, the bond will not simply break." She paused. "It will drag you with him." The room tilted. "How do you know that?" Neve whispered. "Because you collapsed 8 days into separation from a bond that is not even complete." Vedra leaned forward, her sharp eyes holding Neve's. "A full bond would be unbreakable. If the curse consumes him after the bond seals, you die too. That is not speculation. That is fact." The silence that followed was absolute. "So I have 2 choices," Neve said slowly. Stay away and watch him die, or stay close and risk dying with him. Vedra held her gaze. There may be a third option, but it requires him to stop being a stubborn fool long enough to accept help. She stood, smoothing her apron, and it requires you to decide whether he is worth the risk. She left the room. Nev lay in the healer's bed, staring at the ceiling, the ache in her chest so deep it felt structural, like something load-bearing had cracked and the whole architecture of her was threatening to come down. She already knew the answer. She had known it for weeks, maybe longer. Maybe since the first night she watched him sleep and felt something settle inside her that had never been settled before. She just had not been brave enough to say it out loud. Neve found Haddon in his office before the sun had fully risen. She had not slept. She had not needed to. The decision burning in her chest was fuel enough. "I need to get back into his chambers," she said from the doorway. Haddon looked up from his correspondence. He studied her face for a long, measured moment, taking in the shadows under her eyes, the pallor of her skin, the rigid set of her jaw that dared him to refuse. "Vedra spoke to you," he said. "She did. And you understand what you are walking into, better than anyone alive." Haddon set down his pen. He leaned back in his chair and regarded her with an expression she had not seen from him before. Something close to respect. "He will not let you in willingly," Haddon said. "He gave explicit orders. No access, no exceptions." "Then I will go in unwillingly." "His unwillingly, not mine." The corner of Haddon's mouth twitched. The Alpha's chambers have never been locked to his mate. The word hung between them. Mate. No one had said it to her like that before, so plainly, like it was a settled fact rather than a terrifying maybe. "He knows," Neve said quietly, "about the bond. He has known longer than you have," Haddon replied, "which is precisely why he sent you away. He is trying to protect you from his curse by severing the one connection that might save you both." He paused. "He is, with the greatest respect to my Alpha, a fool." "A well-intentioned fool," Neve amended. "The most dangerous kind." Haddon stood and reached into his desk drawer. He withdrew a small cloth pouch and held it out to her. "Take this." Neve opened the pouch. Inside, nestled in dark velvet, lay a ring. It was silver, delicately forged, set with a single moonstone that caught the light and held it, glowing faintly from within like trapped starlight. "What is this?" she breathed. "The moon ring of Ashenmoor. It has been worn by every Alpha's bonded mate for 11 generations." Haddon's voice was quiet. "Soren asked me to keep it safe when the episodes began. He was afraid the forest would corrupt it." Neve stared at the ring. It was beautiful, luminous, and the weight of its history pressed against her palm. "He should be the one to give this to you," Haddon said. "But I suspect he will need convincing. Consider it motivation." She closed her fingers around the ring and felt its warmth, a faint, steady pulse like a second heartbeat. That night, a guard escorted her through the upper corridors, the same route she had walked so many times before, but different now, charged with a gravity that made every step feel deliberate and irreversible. The guard opened the door without a word and left. Nev stepped inside. The fire had burned low. The room was dim, washed in amber and shadow. The moon ring pulsed gently in her closed fist. Soren stood by the window. His back was to her, his silhouette framed against the glass, and beyond him the thorn veil stretched black and endless against the night sky. He looked diminished in a way that made her throat tighten. Thinner, harder, the lines of his body drawn tight as wire. He turned when he heard the door, and the expression that crossed his face when he saw her was a war fought in real time. Relief so profound it buckled his composure, immediately chased by fury, immediately chased by something raw and desperate that had no name. "Who let you in?" His voice was rough. "Your beta, your healer, your guards." Nev closed the door behind her. "Apparently, the entire keep thinks you are being an idiot." "Neve." Her name was a warning. "I collapsed." She moved toward him. 8 days without you and I collapsed on a staircase. Vedra says it is bond deprivation. Haddon says you have thrown 2 guards through walls. The Thornvale has pushed past the northern ward line, something that has never happened in recorded history. She stopped 3 feet from him. Tell me again that staying apart is the safer option. His hands clenched at his sides. She could see the tremor in them, the constant tremor that vanished when she was near and returned the moment she left. The forest will use you to reach me, he said. It is already reaching you. Without me, it is winning. And with you, it could take us both. Then it takes us both. Her voice did not waver. Because I am not going to stand on the other side of a locked door and wait for it to swallow you. He flinched. Actually flinched, like the words had struck something exposed. You do not understand what you are choosing, he said, and his voice had changed. Stripped of command, stripped of authority, what remained was exhaustion and grief and the desperate, jagged honesty of someone who had run out of walls to hide behind. I have not slept in 8 days, he said. I smell you in every room of this keep. On the linens, in the corridors, on my own skin. I reach for you in the dark and you are not there, and it feels like a wound reopening every single time. He took a step toward her, then stopped himself, his jaw clenching. I have spent 9 months fighting the forest. I can fight it. I have. But this, he gestured between them. I cannot fight this and fight the curse at the same time. And I would rather the forest take me than watch it take you. It will take me regardless, Neve said softly. Vedra confirmed it. If the curse kills you, the bond pulls me with you. Sealed or not, complete or not. It is already too late for distance to save me. The blood drained from his face. So you have a choice, Neve continued, her voice steady even as her heart slammed against her ribs. Let me stand beside you and face this together, or push me away and we both die separately. Those are the only options left. She opened her hand. The moon ring sat on her palm, glowing softly in the firelight. Soren stared at it. His expression cracked. Something fundamental shifted behind his eyes, a wall crumbling, a dam giving way. And when he looked at her, there was nothing left between them. He crossed the distance in 2 strides. His hands came up to cup her face, tilting her head back, and his mouth found hers with a hunger that stole every thought she had ever had. She kissed him back with everything she had been holding in for weeks. Her hands found his shirt, his chest, the warm skin beneath. His arms wrapped around her, pulling her against him so tightly she could feel his heartbeat against her own. If you stay, he said against her lips, barely a breath. If you stay, I will not be able to let you go again. Then do not, she whispered. He kissed her deeper, his hands sliding into her hair, and she felt the last of his resistance dissolve like frost in sunlight. He carried her to the bed, laid her down with a gentleness that contradicted the desperation in his hands. And what followed was overwhelming and tender and fierce all at once. 2 people who had been orbiting each other for weeks, finally collapsing into the same space, the same breath, the same heartbeat. When the bond sealed, it was not subtle. It was a roar through every nerve, a golden thread of fire that stitched them together at a depth she had not known existed. He bit her neck, the mating bite, instinctive and claiming, and she bit him back without hesitation, marking him as hers with the same primal certainty. The bond settled between them like a second pulse, warm, complete, unbreakable. Later, in the tangled dark, he slid the moon ring onto her finger. His hands were steady for the first time in months. 11 generations, he said quietly, pressing his lips to her knuckles, and none of them deserved it more than you. Nev pressed her forehead against his chest and breathed him in and felt, at last, like she belonged somewhere. Weeks passed. Golden, impossible weeks. Soren slept every night, deeply and without interruption, his body wrapped around hers like something he was afraid to release. The tremor disappeared. The hollows in his cheeks filled. Color returned to his face, and with it, a version of him she had never seen before, lighter, almost playful. A man who teased her about the drunk heron constellation and left ridiculous notes in her patrol bag and laughed, actually laughed, with a sound that made her chest ache with how much she wanted to hear it again. The cord adjusted, slowly, grudgingly, with the particular stiffness of people confronted by a reality they had not anticipated. The alpha's mate was a boundary walker, a foundling with no bloodline, no rank, no family name. The whispers followed her everywhere. She pretended they did not sting. Then she missed her cycle. Vedra confirmed it with a quiet smile and steady hands. 6 weeks, the healer said. Strong heartbeat. A healthy pup. Neve placed her hand on her stomach and felt the world rearrange itself around a new center of gravity. Soren's reaction, when she told him, was the most transparent she had ever seen him. He stared at her belly, then pulled her against his chest and held her so tightly she had to remind him that she needed to breathe. A child, he said into her hair, his voice thick. Our child. For 3 days, everything was perfect. On the 4th night, Neve woke to the sound of trees, not outside the window, inside her head. The rustle of branches, the creak of trunks, the whisper of leaves that should not have been there. She sat up in the dark, her hand moving instinctively to her belly, and looked at Soren. He was rigid beside her, not sleepwalking. Worse, his eyes were open, black from edge to edge, and he was staring at the ceiling with an expression of absolute horror. She grabbed his hand. The vision hit her instantly. The Thornvale, the clearing. Ansel standing among the dead, his flat eyes fixed on Neve. You gave him something new to lose, the ghost said, and the forest is patient. Neve tore herself free, gasping, and Soren woke beside her with a shattered breath. They stared at each other in the dark. The moon ring pulsed on her finger, frantic and bright. The forest had not been defeated by the bond. It had been learning from it, and now it knew about the baby. Nev did not tell Soren what she was going to do. She knew him well enough by now to understand that telling him would mean stopping her. And stopping her would mean letting the curse continue its slow, patient work until it consumed him, consumed her, consumed the child growing inside her. She was pregnant, barely showing, and she had already begun talking to the baby in the quiet hours before dawn. She would not allow that. She would burn the Thornvale to the ground with her bare hands before she allowed that. The plan came to her fully formed, arriving not like an idea but like a memory, as if some part of her had always known this was where the path led. She had been found at the edge of the Thornvale as an infant, left there, or born there, or delivered there by hands no one had ever identified. Her entire life, she had been drawn to the forest's boundary, had chosen, without understanding why, a profession that kept her walking its edge night after night. The forest had been calling her long before it started calling him. She waited until he was deeply asleep. The bond hummed between them, steady and warm, and she could feel his dreaming, peaceful for now, the golden thread connecting them pulsing with each slow beat of his heart. She slipped out of bed, dressed in silence, pulled on her boundary walker's boots, the ones she had worn the night she tackled him in the grass, and laced them with hands that trembled only slightly. At the door, she paused, turned back, looked at him sleeping in the bed they shared, his face peaceful, his hand resting on the space where she had been. I will come back, she whispered. I promise. She slid the moon ring from her finger. It fought her. The metal seemed to tighten, to pulse with a warmth that begged her not to remove it, but she eased it off and held it in her palm, glowing softly, and felt the bond flicker with alarm. She could not take it with her. The ring was of the pack, of Ashenmore, of him. Where she was going, she needed to go as herself. No titles, no claims, no armor. She placed the ring on his pillow, beside his sleeping hand, and pressed her lips to his temple. Then she walked out of the keep and into the dark. The Thornvale waited. Standing at the ward line for the last time, Nev looked up at the ancient trees and felt no fear. That surprised her. She had expected terror, expected her body to lock and her legs to refuse. Instead, she felt a strange calm, the calm of a woman walking toward something she had been walking toward her entire life without knowing it. She stepped past the ward line. The air changed immediately, colder, thicker, pressing against her skin like hands in the dark. The trees closed behind her, and the path she had seen in her visions materialized beneath her feet, black earth winding between twisted trunks. She followed it deeper. The silence was absolute at first. Then, gradually, sounds emerged. Whispers threading through the branches, footsteps matching her own, the creak of wood and the rustle of things that should not have been moving. The dead appeared slowly, filtering out of the dark between the trees like smoke. She recognized them from the visions. Soldiers and civilians and wolves in human form, their faces slack, their injuries still visible and unhealed. They watched her pass. They did not speak. They did not reach for her. They simply stood and watched, and she realized with a chill that they were not hostile. They were waiting. The clearing opened before her like a held breath. The black pool at its center was still as glass, reflecting nothing, absorbing everything. And beside it, kneeling on the dark earth, was Soren. Her heart lurched. He was already here, but how? She had left him sleeping, had felt his peace through the bond. Then she understood. This was not his body. This was his mind, his guilt, the part of him the curse had chained to this place years ago. The part that returned here every night, even when his body slept safely in their bed. He had never truly left the Thornvale, not once, in all these months. He had simply learned to split himself in two, giving her the surface while the forest kept the depths. "Soren," she said, dropping to her knees beside him. He looked at her, and his eyes were clear, gray, and silver, and full of a grief so old it had become structural. "You should not be here," he said. "Neither should you." Ansel stood at the edge of the pool. He looked younger than the last time, smaller, more like the boy he had actually been and less like the weapon the curse had made of him. His wound was still there, dark and deep, but his expression was different, not accusing, tired, desperately, achingly tired. "Tell her," Ansel said to Soren. "Tell her why you stay." Soren's jaw clenched, his hands pressed flat against the dark earth. "Because I owe them," he said. "Because my brother followed me into a war I chose to fight, and he died for it. Because every person in this clearing is here because of decisions I made, and no amount of time will make that debt smaller." "So you pay it by letting the curse eat you alive," Neve said, her voice thick. "By coming back here every night and agreeing with the thing that is killing you. It is not agreement. It is truth." "It is not truth." Neve grabbed his hands. "Soren, look at me." He met her eyes. The bond between them blazed, wide open, every barrier stripped away. "I was left at the edge of this forest as an infant," she said, the words pouring out of her like something uncorked. "On the ground, in the cold, alone. No name, no family, no explanation. Just a baby in the dirt beside a cursed tree line." Her voice shook. She steadied it through sheer will. "And for 23 years I believed I deserved it. I believed there was something wrong with me, something unlovable, something that made my own parents look at me and decide I was not worth keeping. I built my entire life around being useful to others because I was terrified that if I stopped being useful, everyone would see what my parents saw and leave me too." Tears ran down her face. She did not wipe them. "That belief almost killed me, Soren. It ate me from the inside the same way this forest is eating you. And it was a lie. It was always a lie. I was a baby. I did not deserve to be abandoned. And you were a king fighting a war with no clean answers, and your brother was a boy who made his own choice to follow you, and you did not deserve to lose him." Ansel stepped closer. The ghost's face was wet with tears. "She is right." And this time his voice was not the curse's voice. It was a boy's voice, small and clear and honest. "I followed you because I loved you, because I wanted to be like you. That was my choice, and I would make it again." Soren made a sound. Raw, broken, torn from somewhere so deep it barely qualified as human. You have been punishing yourself for loving people who died, Neve said, gripping his hands tighter. And I have been punishing myself for being born to people who left. We are both wrong. We are both allowed to stop. She pressed his palm against her stomach. Flat, barely showing. But the life inside was there, real and growing and entirely theirs. This child deserves a father who is present, she said. Not one chained to a clearing full of ghosts. And these ghosts deserve to rest. You are keeping them here, Soren. Your guilt is the lock on their cage. Let them go. The forest shuddered. The trees groaned. The pool at the center of the clearing rippled for the first time. Soren looked at Ansel. The boy looked back. I am sorry, Soren said. I am sorry I could not save you. Ansel smiled. Small, peaceful, unbearably young. You did save me, he said. You just never believed it. The ghost reached out and placed his hand over Soren's, over Neve's, over the place where their child was growing. His touch was cold, then warm, then gone. One by one, the dead turned away. They dissolved into the dark like breath into cold air, their faces softening, their wounds finally closing. The whispers faded. The forest exhaled. The pool stilled. The clearing emptied. The trees straightened, their twisted trunks unknotting, their branches releasing the sky. Soren collapsed forward into Neve's arms. She caught him, held him, felt the year of grief and guilt crack open and pour out of him in shuddering waves that shook them both. I have you, she whispered against his hair. I have you. The thorn veil brightened around them. The air warmed. Somewhere far above, through the parting canopy, the first pale glow of dawn broke through. Neve felt arms close around her from behind. Real arms, physical, solid, shaking. She turned and found Soren, the real Soren, standing in the clearing with tears streaming down his face and leaves in his hair and his boots unlaced as if he had dressed while running. He had come after her. Of course he had. She would learn later what it looked like from his side. How he had woken in the dark to cold sheets and an empty bed. How he had seen the moon ring on his pillow, glowing faintly, and understood in a single devastating heartbeat what she had done. How he had run through the keep barefoot, shouting for Haddon, and then kept running when the beta could not move fast enough. How he had crossed the ward line without hesitation, plunging into the Thornvale with nothing but blind terror, and the bond pulling him forward like a rope tied around his chest. How he had followed the golden thread of their connection through the dark, through the dead, through the twisted trees, until he found her kneeling in a clearing that was no longer cursed, holding the space where his guilt used to live. But that was later. In the moment, all she knew was that he was there, and he was real, and his arms were around her, and the forest was letting them go. They walked out of the Thornvale together as the sun rose over Ashenmoor, hand in hand, alive, whole, the ward line crossing beneath their feet like a threshold into a new world. Haddon stood at the tree line with 12 guards, his face drawn with fear that melted into disbelief the moment they emerged. The moon ring sat in his palm, recovered from the pillow where Neve had left it. Soren took the ring from his beta's hand, slid it back onto Neve's finger, and pulled her against his chest. Never, he said into her hair, his voice wrecked and raw, and full of more love than she had ever heard from anyone. Never do that again. No promises, she whispered, and felt him laugh, broken and real and alive. The curse did not vanish all at once. Soren still dreamed of the clearing sometimes, still woke in the dark with the phantom smell of ash in his lungs and the echo of his brother's voice fading in his ears. The grief did not disappear. Grief never does. It simply changed shape, softened from a blade into a bruise, and then from a bruise into an ache that lived quietly in a corner of his chest and no longer threatened to consume him. Neve was there every time he woke. She held him and talked to him, and sometimes she said nothing at all, just pressed her forehead against his shoulder and let the bond hum between them until his breathing steadied. The Thornvale transformed, not overnight, not dramatically, but steadily. the way a held breath finally releases. The twisted trees unknotted over the weeks that followed, the canopy thinned. Sunlight, real sunlight, reached the forest floor after generations of darkness, and where it fell, green things began to grow. The boundary walkers reported wildflowers along the ward line, birdsong from within the trees, a fox den, and then a second one. The Thornvale was not dying, it was healing. Neve walked its edge sometimes, her hand on her growing stomach, and felt nothing but silence from the trees. A comfortable silence, the silence of something at rest. The months that followed were not without difficulty. Neve learned to navigate a court that had never expected someone like her, learned to hold her head steady under the weight of whispers and sideways glances, learned that belonging to someone did not automatically mean belonging to their world. But Soren stood beside her through every awkward dinner and every veiled slight, and slowly the court began to see what he had always seen. Their daughter arrived in the deep quiet of an autumn night, small and red-faced and furious about the whole ordeal. She screamed with a volume that seemed impossible for a creature her size. And Soren, the Alpha King of Ashenmoor, the man who had ended the Grimholt siege through tactical brilliance and brute force, held her in his massive hands and wept. They named her Ansel. Vedra raised an eyebrow. Haddon said nothing, but Neve saw him turn away to compose himself. The court adapted. It took time. A foundling Luna with no bloodline was not what tradition had prepared them for, and the whispers lingered in corners and corridors for months. But the whispers grew quieter as the months passed, as the pack watched their alpha sleep peacefully through entire nights, as they watched the Thornvale bloom, as they watched a boundary walker hold their king's hand at formal dinners and make him laugh in a way no one had ever seen. They will get used to it, Soren murmured against Neve's temple one evening, holding her close while their daughter slept between them. And if they do not, then they can take it up with their alpha. He pressed his lips to her hair. Who is unreasonably, irrevocably, inconveniently in love with his Luna? Neve smiled and closed her eyes. In the distance, beyond the window, the Thornvale stood silver and still beneath the moon, not reaching, not pulling, just breathing, quietly, the way a forest is supposed to breathe. And in the bed, wrapped around each other, the Alpha King and his mate slept.